Welcome, everybody, tuning into September's edition of the Southwest Climate Podcast. As always, Dr. Crimmins.
Hey, Zach. How's it going?
How you feeling?
Feeling good.
Yeah, you got a twinkle in your eye.
Final minutes of the monsoon.
Final minutes of the monsoon. So all I know is that my favorite time of the year is nearing its end. And
are you feeling a little? You seem like you're a little bittersweet.
It is bittersweet. It is
Really?
bittersweet. Well, I think it's more bitter than sweet.
Wow.
I mean, what would be the sweet?
Deep. What part of the sweet?
Yeah. What would
The sweet would be the dew point falling back to normal desert levels, and everything drying out, and that weird moldy smell in my house going away.
Yeah, and the bitterness. What's the bitterness for you?
The beautiful thunderstorms and the epic shows on a nightly basis, and
I do like that. I mean, we are now in the period, the glory time for living in the Southwest when everybody else is descending into cold. You know, we're living it up. So.
Yeah. Don't you love I love the long shadows with the storms still build in September, and we're getting to this 12 hours of daylight, 12 hours a night, and you get the long shadows on the clouds. Perfect light. You're the photographer, so.
I mean, I don't think there's better light anywhere that I've been than some of the evenings during the monsoon season.
For sure.
I mean, sunsets are just absolutely incredible.
Yeah, and I'd argue September too. They can get even a little better. A little better. So
we had a number of those. The most recent one was actually Labor Day weekend, for me at least. And that was up until, and we'll talk about this, but up until a couple of days ago when we finally had some rain after a long protracted break. Labor Day weekend was sort of the last widespread monsoon activity.
You took some epic photos that weekend too, didn't you?
Those were beautiful, beautiful evenings, Mike.
Yeah. Gosh, this is kind of...
Yeah, we're reminiscing here.
It's a little melancholy.
Can we call the end of the monsoon?
You are pushing so hard. You just want this to be over, and I'm not sure why.
Do you think, though, that in 10 days the monsoon picture will change? What's on the horizon?
Anything's possible.
Anything's possible.
East Pacific, baby. That's what I'm talking about. Eyes to the south. Nothing could happen in the next 10 days, but...
Okay, so yes, we'll admit that the monsoon isn't over, but I think going through the numbers and the conversations, the narrative has largely been written. Maybe there's the final paragraph yet to be penned. But...
So what would be your sports column take on this monsoon season then?
Well,
the game's not even over. You're starting to write up the whole game.
My sports metaphor is if we're doing football,
okay,
fourth quarter, 4 minutes to go, and my team's down by 2 touchdowns.
Oh, this is the money. This is
like you need something miraculous.
Yeah.
To change the story.
Right.
Let's put it that way.
Are we talking now your bet on the monsoon total with your team down? Or are you just talking?
No, I'm talking
overall
general.
performance of the monsoon season?
We'll do the numbers later. Yeah, you're
ahead.
You're jumping ahead. I just think at this moment we've got 95% of the monsoon in the suitcase.
Okay.
And I don't know where that.
I like that. I like the in the suitcase. That's a new one. That's good. It's good. It's in the bag. Okay. It's not a bag anymore. It's a suitcase.
It's a suitcase. Okay.
That's good. And hopefully it's a nice
All right.
suitcase.
So let me provide the outline here so people know what they're in for in the next 40 minutes.
They can tune out now.
Yeah. So we'll spend the first part here talking about the last month, do what we usually do, which is recap what's gone on in the climate and the weather since the last time we came at everybody. Then we'll do sort of a broad scale take on the monsoon that's in the suitcase, and we'll leave the clothes that are on the floor for
because they won't fit in the suitcase,
right? In the suitcase for October's discussion.
Right on.
If we feel so inclined, we may prelude what's to come, but we'll do the last 30 days first.
We should get out of the forecasting stuff.
You don't want to talk about ENSO?
We're gonna do a full on therapeutic session on ENSO next month.
That's right. So
there'll be crying.
We'll prelude next month's
shouting,
episode.
There'll be all sorts of antics.
Yeah, we'll talk about the state of the science of
yes,
of
that's
ENSO.
right. We're going to do that
in October. So if that is of interest, please tune into that. So last 30 days, Mike, the big picture in my mind is it was basically dry as soon as Labor Day weekend ended up until a couple days ago.
Right. For Arizona.
There was a long protracted period from basically September 3rd to September 19th, where the monsoon activity died out.
Yeah, there's a couple of nuggets of interesting weather in there. Arizona, mid-August, and right after that, it did quiet down here, but parts of central and northern Arizona actually had a couple of epic days, including some flash flooding up around Cordes Junction, Prescott, Wickenburg. There was a couple of really busy days across northern Arizona, and if I can pull up one of my plots here, there was even a confirmed tornado near Flagstaff in a small just southwest called Niño, Arizona. And there's a local storm report said time-lapse video shows a narrow tornado at approximately 30-degree angle to the ground, persisting for several minutes. That must have been something to see, and I wish I could see that time-lapse video. But it was a busy period.
And that was around when?
It was about the 22nd, 23rd of August. So there was definitely some activity over that period, but it did slow down in southern Arizona.
It basically started slowing down, though, August 27th. I guess going back to all of the monsoon, I mean, once it came in early July, it was basically present in some fashion for many parts of Arizona up until August 27th.
Yeah, you had those kind of ebbs and flows, but if you look at those sort of daily maps of precipitation from, just as you said, right around after 4th of July, we're starting to pick up some of that activity, and then really sets in to motion in the early part of July. A 1 or 2 day brief slowdowns, but still some rain somewhere in the state. But you're right. It wasn't until August 27th that we actually had 3 days in a row where there was no recorded precip, at least in Arizona. Okay,
so in my mind then, there was 2 major events in the last month. There was the Labor Day weekend event. I mean, aside from what you were talking about.
Again, right. And I think those are sort of local. I wouldn't call it a particularly busy period for Arizona in that part of August, but there were some heavy rain events in different parts of the state. A slowdown coming back in after Labor Day, and then another major slowdown in Arizona. And New Mexico's got a pretty different flavor over that period of time as well.
So in September so far, Tucson has logged in about an inch and a tenth of rain. Their average is 1.29 inches over their historical record. So close to average. And most of those came in that Labor Day weekend and the most recent event. I think we should talk a little bit about what just happened September, 19th and 20th?
Yep.
And Mike, what was the flavor of the most recent rainfall?
Well, I think we had talked a little bit about some prep, and I'm going to steal your thunder. Bookends. Would you say it like that? Bookends. It was a very similar event to the one that we had on June 15th that kicked off the monsoon season, sort of June 15th over to 16th, with an approaching trough off the coast of the western U.S., drawing in some real deep tropical moisture to the south and sparking some pretty widespread heavy rain across southeast Arizona that reached all the way up into central and clipped a little bit of the corner of northeast Arizona, and also moved into New Mexico and produced a really nice rain event, 2-day rain event for New Mexico as well.
Yeah, so it was a pretty impactful event, widespread. Tucson got the Tucson airport 3/4 of an inch, although there across the metro area there's a pretty wide variety of amounts. Wilcox 1.5 inches.
That's good.
El Paso all the way over to New Mexico, close to 9/10 of an inch. Phoenix only got about 2/10 of an inch.
Yeah, it really had a hard edge to it to the northeast. We had some within the rain log network here in Arizona. We had a cluster of 3 to 3.5 inch in Green Valley, just south of here. Higher than that, a little bit, almost 3.75. So there was some really impressive September rains with that particular event.
Why did we have that large break in September?
Well, we really moved into a transition pattern. And if you look at the upper level wind patterns over this particular time, there's some note of this in some of the forecast discussions in mid-August. And watching them unfold for the last couple of weeks. But we haven't been in sort of deep easterly flow for any prolonged period of time since the early part of August. So we've been in this kind of transition pattern since the last time we had the podcast. It was only this last event over the last couple of days earlier this week where we had the high sort of build off to the northeast. We did get into a really brief period of easterly flow. It sent across some storm activity across northern Mexico. It actually triggered a surge of moisture. We actually had a tropical depression form right in the Gulf of California, right as the event was going on, helping to influence some more moisture or import some more moisture to the north. Interacting with that trough, this last event really was sort of a transition event. So outside of that event, that dry period prior to that, we've been in this really kind of nice fall pattern where we've had wind flows out of the west at upper levels, which is kind of that.
But you said that sort of started in mid-August.
Yeah, and it's been kind of continuing
and
on.
Yet it was still persistent. The presence of moisture was still persistent, and the widespread monsoon activity was still sort of persistent for much of August.
Yeah.
Normally, when I think of sort of a fall transition period, I think that the breaks between monsoon activity and no monsoon activity are quite pronounced.
Yeah, and we didn't have that too much earlier in the season. Once we kind of hit the gas, we did it pretty good and pretty solid. There's a lot of little, different flavors of the monsoon from that. We can go all the way back to June 15th, right? And I think we're kind of mixing the whole monsoon recap as the game is still being played here. But, that June 15th into 16th event, interaction of a kind of a late season springtime trough coming in off the west coast, tropical storm Bud, those sort of colliding, triggering widespread precipitation across southeast Arizona. Tucson definitely got nailed with that. It was a real good solid bit of precip that's absolutely critical to my bet winning for this particular monsoon season. So it goes.
How many times are you going to say that?
I'm going to say it as many times as I need to. I'll even take an asterisk on this win. Well, if we have to do that. So we start there, and then it breaks down. We have a nice dry period for several weeks, waiting for monsoon moisture to come in, start to finally get that ridge build north of us. We're under super hot temperatures, sort of late June, early July. Finally builds north. We finally get some Gulf surges in place after July 4th. This is like 5th, 6th, and 7th, and then we're off to the races, right? And then we've been in the soup all the way up until basically September, after the Labor Day event, where we actually start to see a little bit of dips in the dew point temps, at least here in Tucson, and start to see a dry out. But it didn't even dry out that much because it wasn't a real strong westerly flow that was really scouring out and bringing in that dry air from the west. It was just kind of a weak transition pattern, left some room for stuff to build back in, and that happened.
So when you say build
way.
back in, what do you mean?
Starting to be able to have the tropical moisture close enough on your doorstep that you can draw it back in and build it in a way that would actually be meaningful to produce some precipitation.
Right, and so that happens as if the ridge sort of moves north, and it sort of can allow for that moisture to seep in from the south.
Right.
But it can also happen if you have, let's say, a big convection complex in Sonora that flares up and sort of drives outflows up into our region, or if you have a passing disturbance at the foot of the Gulf of California that can sort of push moist air up the Gulf of California. So there's a couple different mechanisms at play there.
So you think about it in terms of the fancy term moisture advection, right? So the actual advecting or moving of that moist air into the region, sort of in the middle of the monsoon season, since the jet stream's far to the north, and we don't have many sort of gradients in pressure and wind. You end up having to rely on these thunderstorm complexes or these advective processes that are kind of outflow driven from these clusters of thunderstorms. We're now in the transition season. You start to now see sort of high and low pressure systems set up, and you have a little bit stronger advection because of these pressure differentials. And that's a little bit of both happened, I think, in the last couple of days. Again, we're not talking about a late fall low pressure system moving across here. We just had a low set up, trough off to the west coast, and the subtropical high had gotten shoved off to the east, exactly the way the map looked in June.
Mm-hmm.
But we also had easterly flow because the ridge was to the north, and we had thunderstorms firing off across. So we did have those kind of outflows that you described, move some of that moisture in. And then we had some, pretty solid moisture advection from pressure gradients and a Gulf surge and an approaching tropical depression.
I mean,
so it was a lot of really good ways of moving moisture up in here really quickly.
It's kind of a classic case of all the complexity of the monsoon.
We had every moving widget part thing that you could, it's like all the ingredients that you wouldn't want to throw together in some kind of dish. You just threw them all in. Every kind of spice you want, let's go for it. What
was also interesting about that last event was, you woke up and there was clouds.
Yeah.
And so there was no sun.
Yeah.
And
it was like, is this going to happen or not?
Yeah, because I think at that point I knew that we didn't necessarily need heating of the surface to cause that uplift, that there was something else going on.
Right.
But I think that's important. It just is another example of how you can generate monsoon precipitation through various mechanisms.
I've been here long enough, and we've done enough of this, on the knife edge of watching the weather develop in the day. And we were all chatting each other all day about looking at the model runs and waiting for the next model run to come. And it was an amazing, we look at these maps of how it was dry. It looked like the monsoon was done, right? And for all intents and purposes, it probably was done unless we had this Gulf surge and tropical depression and all the activity in the East Pacific.
So for 14 days prior, you look at the maps and there's no moisture anywhere. There's no, not moisture, but there's no precipitation anywhere.
Yeah, and I think we all got asked questions like, is the monsoon over? Is the monsoon over? And you're like, well, very easily it could have been it.
I said it was.
We could have sailed. I think you did call it. And I had a couple people ask me, and I was like, well, for all intents and purposes, if you look at the stats for Tucson, the average last day of recordable or measurable precip in the long-term record is about June 15th, 16th, 17th. We're just kind of crossing that threshold. And so just on that climatology, totally plenty of years where it just doesn't rain anymore. But
did you say June 5th?
Sorry, September.
Okay. Yeah.
They're all, whatever,
same
months.
June, September.
Yeah. Bookend, man. It's all about bookends. It's that we could have sailed out of the season, but in a year where the tropics were quiet and if that monsoon boundary too, meaning that hard edge of the moisture is really retreating south quickly, and you don't have a way of quickly moving it back up into the region, then you can easily get out of the season, then we're kind of done. But the East Pacific has been busy this year. There have been clusters of thunderstorms kind of wandering around, and then that transition season when we start to be able to turn that flow out of the south up into Arizona through these pressure differentials, then you got something to work with.
So you're right. The East Pacific has been extremely busy, and I think we've had 16 named storms in the East Pacific. Obviously, not all of those influence us here, but
right.
Okay, so the East Pacific has been active, but one thing that, at least in my reading, I hadn't seen a lot of talk about is the surges. Was I just missing the commentary on the surges, or did we have fewer surges coming up the Gulf?
I think what's interesting, and again, this is a bit anecdotal without having any information in front of me, but we didn't have these really distinct sort of big surge, retreat, dry down, waiting for the next big surge. We had this sort of slow leak of moisture up into Arizona in particular. And you can look at the dew point plot at the airport here in Arizona. And so just as we described it earlier, right, which was about July 1st, the daily average dew points in Tucson were about just a little over 25 degrees Fahrenheit. Do you remember the last 25 degree Fahrenheit dew point day? Well, it was July 1st. That level of dew point depression or that low relative humidity, I'm craving that right now, man. I really am. I want to feel that that aridity again.
Yeah.
This is the whiner part of having a good monsoon. But since that day,
but I think the good the vigorous monsoon is,
it was
in
great.
our rear view mirror, and so I'm anticipating drier conditions.
I think you're totally right.
Yeah.
And so you can do this for any of the dew point traces in Arizona, and you can take a look at New Mexico. But this one to Arizona is off to the races, and so by July 8th, the daily average dew point was above 65, and then it was solid above 65. There's a quick break in July, back down below 50. I'm sure we would have noticed that dry down. But then it gets back up. And we had many more days, maybe 2/3 of the days since July that were above average daily dew points in Tucson. And the biggest crater we had, which was in that dry period in mid-September, where we got back down to about 40 as a daily average dew point.
Right, and at that time, though, like the dew point is sort of waning, and
it didn't stand out, right?
Yeah, it's kind of more expected. I mean, prior to that, maybe you just said this, but we had very few days where the dew point was below average.
Yeah, and then that event on the 19th, just looking at this plot, the daily average dew point got above 65. That was almost the most humid day of the entire monsoon, which again is that convergence of all that tropical moisture and that real strong advection.
So to me, when I think about what the defining characteristics of the 2018 monsoon is, I think of two things. One, both of which you've already mentioned. That it came on with a grand entrance, and it sort of left. If we think that the 19th and 20th was the final gasp of the monsoon, it left in a grand way as well.
Totally
bookends, as you were saying. And the other thing is this just persistence. Once it started, the persistence of moisture around.
Yeah.
And in a way to me, so if you look at Tucson, emblematic here, the total precipitation so far is, I think, 115% of average. Let me double check that. But that's 7 inches, and it normally gets a little bit over 6.
Yep.
So that's pretty good. But I don't know, maybe you disagree with me on this, Mike, but given the persistence of the moisture, I kind of feel like we could have gotten more out of this.
Such a glass half full or half empty, or what's the pessimism?
And
half empty.
If you take away, and we quibbled about this last podcast, but if you take away the 15th, June 15th, I mean, we're sort of hovering around average. And if we're hovering around average, and yet we've had dew points persistently high, persistently above average, maybe not as high as they reached last year during that really epic July period, but they've been high. To me, I feel like we could have squeezed more out of the monsoon. I don't know. What's your take on that?
Yeah, like monsoon efficiency index, right? Like capitalizing on like missed precipitable water or something like that. That's good.
Yeah, that is good.
If you total up the precipitable water for every day and then compared it,
what's the maximum potential?
Totally meaningless from a physical standpoint, but would be really cool. We should totally do that.
No, but what's your take on?
See, it's interesting, and this is. I think I said this the last podcast, but to me, this monsoon was super showy, had a lot of flair, solid performance, but yeah, it didn't like knock it out of the park as far as like total precip.
But could we have knocked it out of the park?
Probably not. I think it's like as efficient as a monsoon's going to get as far as with this. It's not like we ended up having a lot of days where it was super humid, and we didn't have a lot of days where it was the too wet for rain situation where you just like get all of that low level moisture in here, and then you just like the sun comes up and fires off clouds and then just shades it out and it doesn't rain anywhere. It was, really good, I think, atmosphere for firing off mountain storms. They wouldn't always happen in the same spot. And again, I think this is because we live in Tucson. There is a definite sort of donut hole in precipitation amounts in the central part of Tucson where everybody lives, but there's really good precip amounts all over the place and around the region. And then you go to other parts of the state, real solid performance. There have been some losers, especially in Arizona. Northeast part of Arizona, in Hopi and Navajo, they just didn't show up. I mean, they got a little bit of rain in August, and they did get some rain out of this most recent event, but not much. And so the monsoon was basically a no-show. And then far western Arizona did not see a ton of storms rolling out or big events rolling up the Gulf of California, so it had been dry there. And then I think New Mexico had kind of midland performance throughout the whole season, dried down. You can see it, I think a really mixed bag there as far as precipitation.
Let me just put some numbers to that, because that was a really good tour around Arizona. So Flagstaff, including the most recent rain from the last couple of days, Flagstaff, their average is 8.3 inches. They're at 9.93, so that's 120% of average. Mm-hmm. Prescott's been the big winner. When you look at like larger cities, if you will, or towns. Prescott's average is 8.5 inches. They've received 12.2 inches. Interestingly, they didn't get any from the last couple of days.
Yep.
But that's 144% of average. Phoenix just misses out. It just misses out on the monsoon.
Yeah,
always.
but I think if you asked any Phoenician this year, they'd be like, "This is the best monsoon ever."
Right. So this number doesn't do Phoenix justice, and we spent a lot of time last episode talking about how much activity Phoenix has been getting. But their average is 2.71 inches, and that's what I was referring to.
Right. They almost got it all.
and they've gotten 2.6 inches, so they're at 95% of average. So they're right at average.
Right.
Tucson, I said this before, 6.1 on average, and we're at 7 right now, so that's 115% of average. Wilcox, 3.5 is their average, and they've received 4.65, so they're at 133% of average. And then we'll do El Paso as well, and that average is 5.1 inches, and they've received about 5, so they're at average. So yeah, there's been no duds, and you mentioned a few.
There's a couple of slow spots around the state that really could have used the precipitation, given the last summer's really. I mean, we can really contrast this to last summer, right? I mean, last summer was an abject failure as far as monsoon precipitation in a lot of parts of the state. It's harder to say that here. It really was. Again, I think Northeast Arizona, that was really problematic to not get more precip that they've seen, and maybe parts of far southwest, but that's a fairly dry location anyways. But yeah, I mean, this is night and day compared to last summer's monsoon.
Yeah, I'm saying that because at least in Tucson, it was an epic. June was epic. We got 6 inches in June alone, or not June, July.
Last July, yeah. That's your benchmark, isn't it?
Yeah,
that's like stuck in your psyche.
It is so burned in my mind. Yeah,
I know. Got to open your mind, man.
Okay.
Embrace
all right,
the
Mike.
climate.
So before we zoom in on Tucson, you've alluded to this already. We had our outstanding bet, and I think I think we can do the tally. So coming in, I was a little bit pessimistic, and I said that Tucson at the airport would receive 5 3/4 inches. So that was slightly below average, right? And I was, you couldn't call me gloom and doom.
I could though.
You, on the other hand, you were fairly.
I was feeling good, man.
You were feeling good, yeah. Maybe it was a Friday, and you were thinking about like some good IPA or something.
I think
like
it
that.
Probably was that, yeah.
7.5 inches.
Yep.
So as I said, Tucson Airport's at 7 inches. So Mike, once again, you've officially won. Now there is one caveat.
Okay.
That we did put a stipulation that if you went over, you couldn't go over.
Yeah.
So if there is a but if there is a
you can call it rogue
tropical storm there, remnant hurricane that wafts in here in the next week or so, that
I so want to get this right. I want to nail 7.5. Like I want now, like a tropical depression to just nick the airport.
So beer's on me today.
Oh, this is awesome.
What are you gonna get?
IPA. Yeah, I think you nailed that.
All right. So anything stand out more than we've talked about for you about the monsoon?
No.
That's it.
I don't know what else to say.
We've covered it all.
Again, I think we've said it earlier. It had a little bit of everything from beginning to end. I mean, it really didn't. It didn't disappoint.
Hide. It never hid
exactly.
This year, until September.
I think we got frustrated kind of mid-season where it was raining everywhere around town except at our houses. But, if you think about those monsoon seasons where maybe it'll build in and then it dries out and there's not a cloud in sight in the middle of the summer, that's maddening. And that this year did not have that. It had something showy going on within, eyesight, at least down here in southern Arizona, almost every day, right?
Yeah, I agree. It did not disappoint in terms of interest. There was always something present to look at. And every time I looked at the radar, I think I said this last time, but every time I looked at the radar, there was some severe storm somewhere in Arizona.
We had these different mechanisms at play, like the big events in the early part of September where these really strong transition type events where it was, firing off like close to supercell type, Midwestern thunderstorms given the sheer environment and the upper level winds interacting with the moisture. And, that was when we were talking about just some epic rains across parts of southeast Arizona. You and I and Ben were trading chats on that where I noted that one of the rain gauges in a very remote part of southeast Arizona near Arvapa Canyon got 3 inches, and then this canyon flooded out. It went to 6,000 CFS, and we were concerned if there were hikers in there, and Ben found that there was a news report that they had to airlift some people out of there. So and this was over Labor Day weekend when you'd expect to see hikers in that canyon because it's permitted. But there's, that, and then the crazy epic rains north of Phoenix that flooded out some communities, the persistent haboobs and crazy storms that would roll off the mountains through parts of Phoenix. I'd gotten some emails from some rain loggers south of Phoenix who didn't have any rain at all the whole summer. Like they just watched all the activity. Heard from one of my ranching friends up in Tonto that, once the monsoon set in, they just had great persistent rainfall and grew a bunch of grass up there. So not bad, man, not bad. Again, I don't want to, and again, there's always going to be a loser during the monsoon season, right? And so I think there were, a couple of pockets of that.
Well, that raised a question when I was looking at the data. Has there ever been a monsoon where it's almost been completely categorically above average?
Like everywhere?
Everywhere.
Wow. This is something we should have researched, right? Like there's probably an answer to that.
I was thinking about the spatial imprint of the monsoon and, what's been the best monsoon?
Ever?
From that perspective,
I don't know.
No, I know. I'm not asking you for an answer. I'm just saying
you're looking expectantly at me.
Well,
what year was that, Crimmins? I don't know.
Anyway, the other thing that we didn't talk about that I think is interesting is just like honing in on Tucson. There was quite a big variance in precipitation within Tucson, and you mentioned this briefly that the central Tucson was the big loser. And the donut hole is what you said, and
it's not even that bad in the middle of Tucson. That's the thing. I think Tucsonans suffer from there's some disorder here of like monsoon precipitation disorder.
Well, okay, so if I'm looking at a map now that has a bunch of rain loggers, thank you rain loggers,
yes.
do a heroic job, as well as the Pima County Flood Control District alert system. And so there's
the Kokoroz observers and
this map doesn't have that. Yeah. But you can get a fairly spatially dense representation of the monsoon from this network.
Right.
On the east side of Tucson, out by Saguaro National Park, Saguaro East, there's values in between 9 and 12 inches.
Yeah.
And that's sort of, you go inwards towards central Tucson and you see some values around, 3-4 inches. And actually up north in Oro Valley, in that area, again, you see a little bit more precipitation up there. And then when you look at these maps, across time, you can actually see that there is, the northern and eastern section, when there was bigger events, those were the areas that got the bigger events and sort of missed the central Tucson.
I have a confession.
What's that?
I got over 8 inches this monsoon season. It could have something to do with my lack of empathy for the 3 and 4 inch totals in the middle of town, given that I've had twice as much rain at my house.
Well, good for you, Mike. All I'm saying is that there is quite a large variance in precipitation.
It's very possible
across Tucson.
My whole demeanor in this entire podcast would be different if I had gotten 4 inches this monsoon season versus 8 inches.
What's the average at your place?
6.
You just transpose the airport to your
Of course I do.
house.
Just drag that average all over town. I don't know. We're working on that to actually try
How
to figure
many
that
years do you have data for?
out. I think about 6 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so where does this fall?
It's 2 inches above average.
Okay. That's a long-term record.
Okay, fair enough. That is absolutely true. Midtown Tucson, the monsoon was a spectator sport. And there's really only maybe 3 or 4, 5 days where you can really say that they got some head-on widespread precipitation. And you have to include the widespread event of June 15th.
And the last one.
Right. Those are the ones that, really, I think, fill everything in. Other than that,
it's crazy though if you take those 2 away. And I don't know why if we would take those 2 away, but if you did,
it's regulation time, man. Yeah.
Well, okay. Before ending, I did want to ask, because we did quibble about June 15th as being whether or not we should count that as a monsoon. And I know, you were sort of arguing that we should, in part because of our outstanding bet. But you also mentioned in the beginning that they looked similar.
Yeah.
But it also seems to me that there's no way that we would say that, the September 19th, 20th event was not a monsoon event.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right.
So why can we quibble about the 15th and not the 19th of September? The 15th of
there
June.
may be some very subtle differences. I think the 15th and 16th were I don't think they were triggered by a Gulf surge. I don't think that moisture import was much more advective given the approaching trough and drawing up Tropical Storm Bud there. And there wasn't a prior sort of deep easterly flow. There wasn't any of this sort of outflow building of moisture to the north, kind of as you described earlier about the way to sort of build in. It wasn't monsoon pattern at that point. It had glimmers of hope of the monsoon approaching, but it was also very early. So, I mean, it was the earliest, I think, quote unquote monsoon event on record. Really?
Well, I mean, can it get earlier than June 15th?
No, but it rains on June 15th.
I don't think...
And it's kind of arbitrary. I mean, it's like it would not have met the dew point definition.
No, it would not have met the dew point.
It would not have been in, that wouldn't have been in play for there. We dried back out. We didn't actually meet the dew point definitions, I think, till the 8th of July. Yeah. And so, I'm having trouble arguing I'm not giving up this win.
Asterisk.
I'm keeping it. I'll take the asterisk.
You're the Lance Armstrong of climatologists.
Totally don't care. This is doped up.
We'll call you Barry Bonds.
Whatever, man. I'll take it. Yeah. If that's what it takes to win in the monsoon season, which is what it does take to win in the monsoon season, because this is just a mess, man, right? Yeah. The 19th event, though, had this really kind of quick shift around that I think you could call kind of monsoony. It wasn't pure, and it certainly wasn't like the middle of August or the middle of July, but it's what you'd expect to see in September. And what we saw in June is what you'd expect to see in June. They were very seasonal.
And what we saw in July was what we'd expect to see in July?
Absolutely. This is why climatology
brilliant.
works. This is why climatology works, Zach, because you have expectations based on historical patterns and distributions.
Okay, so wrapping up here, what is the chances that in the next 10 days, is there anything on the horizon that we may look out for?
Well, we still have this, we're in that transition pattern. The monsoon, so tropical ridge is slinking back south as you'd expect to, as the sun angle is now much lower. We're starting to see the patterns sort of shift around. This is really, again, prime time if you have any activity in the East Pacific, and if it's timed just right, it could get drawn up in front of an approaching trough.
Right.
Not unlike what we had on the 19th.
So
that's possible.
One of the models picks up a tropical storm. I don't know if it'll be a tropical storm, but
it sure looks like it. I mean, it looks pretty good. And again,
but it doesn't recurve it back east.
Well, one of the modeled runs did. And so if you watch the GFS right now, the GFS is spinning up storms, multiple storms right off the southern coast of Mexico, which is just still firing off, and they're all moving up kind of their climatological direction, which is off to the northwest. So any one of those, if it's timed right, could move back in here. But you're going to see a lot of these phantom storms in that model sort of spin up. The next model run will be gone. The ensemble just kind of smooths it all out and averages it out because one member will have it and 5 don't. So it just sort of disappears. So it's really tough. It's kind of day by day over the next 10 days, but it's totally possible.
Okay, so I think we've done the monsoon.
Put a bow on it?
Put a bow on it.
If I win, I'd call it, man. I think that's fine.
No, I'm ready to, since we're going to have Friday afternoon
if we're going to get a beer.
I will pay up. I don't know. I don't think I've beat you yet.
So I think we should use that time to think about what the next wager is and get creative about it.
Okay, so why don't we just leave our audience with a taste of October's podcast. Like we said in the beginning, this is the time where we start thinking about El Niño and La Niña's effect on our winter precipitation. There is some hints that we're moving into a weak El Niño.
Yeah.
Looks a lot like it did 4 years ago. There's also some really interesting science out, really cool science paper out that sort of summarize the state of knowledge, including what are some unresolved questions.
Yeah, I think we should dive into that one, and that'll. I think again, that's the therapeutic where some tears and that kind of stuff might come out. And I think
Wait, what's the therapy?
Trying to like get our head around the failed 15-16 event, which that paper does a really nice job of saying, what did we miss and what are we not thinking about? And I think you and I have talked about this over the years, but paying a little better attention to the actual pattern of the sea surface temperatures and
right. It's not this monolithic pattern that people.
It's not even the way we treat it in the forecast, which is monolithic, one analog.
Right.
If there's an El Niño, it'll be wet, and if there isn't, it'll be dry.
Right.
It's
if you look at this, if you look at the CPC's forecast for precipitation, the pattern that they have painted on there, which is above in the southern tier of the U.S. and below average or in their lower tercile, I should say, in the Pacific Northwest, is like the canonical.
Yeah,
but it doesn't treat maybe the nuance of what's going on in the sea surface temperatures in the Pacific.
And then we'll take a look at the discussions to see what they're trying to sort out of there. And I guess we shouldn't, since we're sort of leaning into October, it is still tropical storm season, and so like we're going to be done with this monsoon, but the East Pacific is busy. We have had over the past couple of years tropical storms move up into Arizona. We ended up having an epic hail event out of an interaction with some tropical moisture and a approaching cold front across in Safford a couple of years ago in the beginning of October that triggered a bunch of federal relief. So October typically is fairly boring. We're thinking about moving into the wintertime pattern, but it is, the floods of record in Arizona are October. So we got to be a little bit vigilant, but you don't know those things until they're just about upon you. So
that's right. You got it. So thanks everybody for tuning in. Happy birthday, Ned. See y'all later.
All right. Bye-bye.
The Southwest Climate Podcast is a production of CLIMAS, which is part of NOAA's Regional Integrated Science and Assessment Program and is housed at the University of Arizona Institute of the Environment. Mike Crimmins is a principal investigator with CLIMAS, a professor of soil, water, and environmental science in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, and climate extension specialist with the University of Arizona Cooperative Extension. Zack Guido is a research scientist with the Institute of the Environment and UA program manager of the International Research and Applications Program. The podcast is edited and produced by Ben McMahon, research, outreach, and assessment specialist with CLIMAS.
Did you record that shrug? I have no idea.
I mean, it's more than a shrug.